Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the sophomore album from Purity Ring, titled Another Eternity. You know, it's a weird experience for me listening to Purity Ring. I mean, see, when they finally released their debut album Shrines back in 2012, after drip feeding it a number of singles, it immediately attracted a lot of attention from critics and the public for the plethora of bizarre contradictions that you'd hear on the album. Gleaming, shimmering keyboards that are reminiscent of the cleanest sort of dream pop and synth pop, paired with roiling waves of wobbling, heavy synth and hi-hats that remind me a lot of trap-flavored hip-hop. The ghostly vocals of Megan Jane's, they were paired with these cavernous, oily moans of pitch-shifted vocals. Her very sweet delivery paired with lyrics that were both intricate and innocent and yet shockingly graphic when you started reading into them. The band was layers upon layers of impenetrability paired with a certain visceral sound that didn't really need layers of deconstruction to really understand on a gut level. And when you eventually did parse out the lyrics, they did very much match that feel. So okay, with all that being said, why have I never really been a huge fan of Purity Ring? Well, some of the reasons are pretty basic. I'm just not a fan of pitch-shifted vocals in any capacity, for example. The sound just kind of turns me off, even though down-tuning is preferable to the god-awful chipmunk voice. But for me, as visceral and borderline primal as the emotions Purity Ring struck up could be, it always felt they were blunting it through being needlessly obtuse. Now don't get me wrong, I like intricate poetry, but the writing style just didn't connect as well as I'd liked, almost being overwritten for its own sake. The dichotomies of Purity Ring remind me a lot of St. Vincent's mid-period work on Actor or Strange Mercy, but St. Vincent always felt a lot more grounded, mature, and very human in her writing instead of Purity Ring's approach of spiraling away into twee abstractions, take away from the plentiful gore that if you actually thought about it literally. And when you started to, it got pretty disgusting. So when I heard that Purity Ring was opting to go for more of a pop style, I was both optimistic and a little bit concerned. On the one hand, a stronger pop approach could lead to a more succinct and direct style of writing, but would the poetry be as interesting without the flowery language? Would they actually pare back the graphic elements, which were actually pretty good? And what would that mean for the instrumentation or the production? So I made sure to take a look at Purity Ring's sophomore album, Another Eternity. What do we get? Well, here's the thing. It's definitely an interesting case, because this record is definitely more accessible to a pop audience. And if you ignored the lyrics, you could potentially find most of these songs finding an easy spot on mainstream pop radio. But here's the thing. Considering how much of modern pop, especially in 2013 and 2014, drew from Purity Ring's instrumental style that they pioneered, is the duo reclaiming the style by moving towards it, or simply sliding into a niche that they helped build? And moving past that question, is the album any good? Well, yeah, sure, it's pretty good, but I would not call this album great or essential. In other words, for me, it seems about on par with the last Purity Ring album, in that it's not really connecting with me as strongly as I'd like. It's still pretty damn good, but not quite great. So okay, why do I think that? Well, let's start off with the instrumentation and the production, where I'd argue there's actually been some real improvements. For one, the pitch-shifted vocals are almost entirely gone from this record, which is a major plus, and there are some great synth tone choices that might not feel strikingly cohesive with the rest of the mix, but they do stand out well. One thing is for sure, you can definitely tell that Purity Ring's festival experiences has played to the real expansion of their sound. The low-end synths are a lot heavier and meatier, hi-hats are occasionally swapped out for hand claps, the mix isn't so much cavernous or swallowed in reverb as it just feels really big, and there are synth lines that seem to beg for an EDM DJ to remix the hell out of it and play in the latest nightclub. And you know what, I will give Purity Ring this. When they can get a good shimmering melody going, they can make some gorgeous moments on this album. The piano on Heartside, the echoing reedy synth against the faded hollow beat on Repetition, the gleaming keys on Begin Again, the eerie EDM shimmer against the rattles and claps on Dust Hymn, the twinkle against that thunderous beat on Flood on the Floor, even despite the pitch-shifted vocals, and the hazy pianos of Stillness and Woe. But remember when I said this record is very reminiscent of mainstream pop? Well, if we're looking for the primary area, it'd be the problem that I have with most of modern pop music for the past year now, with percussion and beats giving them a lot more priority than the melody and the mix, which makes an already pretty similar feeling album even harder to differentiate between song to song. Which is a damn shame because, as I said, the melodies are actually pretty damn good when you can hear them, make them out. But for as much as the beats are at the forefront, it bizarrely doesn't really translate into solid propulsive grooves, especially on songs like Push Pull, where the jittery keyboard line throughout the chorus seems to be from an entirely different song and just does not match the beat or the vocals well at all. What this also unfortunately means is that it's also strangely easy to draw a lot of comparisons to other percussion-heavy pop acts, especially in the mainstream, if only because it's a recognizable formula. And while a lot of critics have drawn parallels to Taylor Swift's 1989, I think a much more stark comparison to me comes with the debut album from Tove Lo, Queen of the Clouds, a much more transparently commercial record that probably owes a debt to Purity Ring's early work on some level, and also one that feels tighter and more focused than this record, especially considering both are covering very similar lyrical subject matter and themes. Now, unlike that record, Another Eternity isn't as narrative driven, but does have similar subjects and framing, dealing with relationships that were probably for all the wrong reasons and portrayed to keep all flaws in plain view from both partners. In this case, our protagonist seems to be doing everything in her power to insulate and absorb her partner's internal demons and problems, almost trying to save him from himself. And said partner starts exploiting said relationship, immediately starts being a capricious, manipulative asshole. What becomes disheartening is you get the feeling that the narrator knows she's being exploited here, and yet she keeps coming back, not willing to give up a desperate hope that it'll somehow manage to work out in the end. And especially gets brutal near the back half of the album, where she asks him to give something to help her, and the illusion with which she's been deceiving herself finally really shatters, leading to the ominous closer of Stillness and Woe, where they both are forced to confront the reality of the situation. Now, all that sounds like pretty potent stuff with some real nuance and emotional power that I would normally like, so why isn't it hitting me nearly as hard as it should? Well, part of this circles back to the songwriting. As I expected, Purity Ring did choose to make their songs more straightforward and dial back some of the lyrical flights of fantasy, which would have been great if they hadn't cut back most of the visceral bite of the lyrics along the way. While Shrines was a graphic record drenched in bodily fluids and visceral power, Another Eternity doesn't quite seem to touch that writing in the same way, and this comes to an issue of abstraction. Even though the metaphors and symbolism took time to decode on Shrines, that style of writing was so powerful and evocative that you almost didn't need to know what it all meant to get the real feeling of that album. But when you tone back that style, or even start repeating that style, you just don't get the same feeling. And considering that Purity Ring is rarely direct, that power just does not connect for me in the same way. Instead of really cutting to the point, they cut off the point, which effectively delivers a similar, if not less satisfying result, at least for me. And you know, part of this circles back to Megan James's vocal delivery. And look, part of it is personal preference, I'll admit that, and that the very girlish vocal affectation that she picks doesn't really do a lot for me. A part of the strength of that delivery on Shrines is placing it in sharp contrast with the subject matter and the writing. And here the contrast isn't nearly as stark, or rather it's very different in a way that demands more vocal nuance from her. You need to buy into her complicated emotions beyond just pure vulnerability, which she can convey, and we don't quite get that snapshot into her anger and frustration at the situation, her desperation and real sadness here. Part of this is the blatant pitch correction that's piled onto her voice, and on some level, you know what, I get why it might have been used. I'm not exactly going to complain about it here. After all, when Kanye used it on 808s and Heartbreak, he was doing it to blunt his own humanity, to detach from the situation, and you could argue that Megan James is using it in a very similar purpose. But I'm not quite sure it works as well, because there are other subtler emotions that should be conveyed to make this album really work that the auto-tune just completely slathers over and mutes, which kind of gets frustrating, at least for me. So look, overall, I actually do really like this album. For a modern indie pop record, it's pretty solid, and it's easily listenable with well-written lyrics and a couple songs that really do dig deep into a toxic relationship. But every time I listen through Another Eternity, I keep getting distracted by the fact that I should like this album a lot more than I do, which does knock it back from being great to simply just being pretty good for me. As it is, it gets a light 7 out of 10, and definitely a recommendation, especially if you're a Purity Ring fan and you want to hear more of similar material. That's a little bit tad more accessible. Otherwise, well, if you like modern pop music in the past year, you'll probably dig this album, so check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Sorry I'm a little bit low on energy this week. I've just been really sick this entire weekend. It's been absolute hell. But I'm trying to get some reviews out, still working full throttle. But until then, if there's anything else you want me to review in coming weeks, or if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.